At 2:45 a.m. on the 6th of August, 1945, a B-29 Superfortress bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from the island of Tinian in the Pacific Ocean. The aircraft was part of the 509th Composite Group, a unit created for a single, secret purpose. The commander was Colonel Paul Tibbets. The mission was designated Special Bombing Mission No. 13. On board, secured in the forward bomb bay, was a weapon unlike any in human history. The weather over Japan was favorable. The primary target was Hiroshima, a city of roughly 300,000 people. The secondary target was Kokura, then Nagasaki. The decision to proceed rested on visibility. At 6 a.m., the weather scout plane reported clear skies over Hiroshima. The bombing run was set. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bomb was released from an altitude of 31,000 feet. It took 43 seconds to fall. At 8:16, it detonated approximately 1,900 feet above the center of the city. The explosion released energy equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT. A blinding flash, a shockwave, and a fireball consumed the landscape. Within minutes, a mushroom cloud rose to over 50,000 feet. On the ground, temperatures at the hypocenter reached several million degrees Celsius in the first microsecond. Structures within a mile were vaporized. Fires joined into a firestorm. The number of dead by the end of the year would be estimated between 90,000 and 146,000. Many more would suffer from radiation sickness and burns. What happened? That weapon, codenamed Little Boy, was the product of the Manhattan Project, a secret enterprise that began 3 years earlier, in 1942, but whose roots reached back to the scientific discoveries of the 193s. The project was a response to the fear that Nazi Germany might develop an atomic bomb first. It was an undertaking of staggering scale. At its peak, it employed nearly 130,000 people, cost roughly $2 billion, the equivalent of about $30 billion today, and involved dozens of secret facilities across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. The scientific foundation came from a series of breakthroughs. In 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of an atom's nucleus, releasing enormous energy. Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch explained the process theoretically. The possibility of a chain reaction, of a self-sustaining release of energy, was recognized immediately. Scientists in several countries began to explore the implications for weapons. By 1939, physicists in the United States, including Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein, understood that a fission bomb could be built. Einstein signed a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, drafted by Szilard, warning of the danger of German progress. Roosevelt responded by creating the Advisory Committee on Uranium, a small group that would eventually grow into the massive Manhattan Project. But the committee moved slowly at first. The breakthrough came in 1941, when the British Maud Committee concluded that an atomic bomb was feasible. The United States ramped up its efforts. In 1942, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took over the project, with General Leslie Groves as its military director. Groves was a hard-driving engineer who had overseen the construction of the Pentagon. He understood the need for speed and secrecy. He chose J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead the theoretical work at a new laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The project was divided into multiple tracks. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, massive facilities were built to enrich uranium using electromagnetic separation, gaseous diffusion, and thermal diffusion, each a complex industrial process. At Hanford, Washington, plutonium was produced in nuclear reactors. At Los Alamos, scientists designed and built the actual bombs. The entire operation was compartmentalized. Few knew the full picture. Even the workers at the plants did not know what they were making. They were told only that their work was vital to the war effort. The first test of the weapon came on July 16, 1945, at the Trinity site in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico. At 5:29 a.m. Mountain War Time, A plutonium implosion device, codenamed Gadget, was detonated on a 100-foot tower. The flash was visible for miles. The heat was felt by observers in bunkers 10,000 yards away. The explosion created a crater of green glass, fused from the desert sand. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The success of the Trinity test confirmed that the weapon worked. The war in Europe had ended in May, but the war with Japan continued. The United States was planning a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, which was expected to result in massive casualties on both sides. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, authorized the use of the atomic bomb against Japan. How could this have happened? That question can be asked from many angles. How could scientists, many of whom were pacifists or refugees from fascism, agree to build a weapon of such destruction? How could a secret project of this scale remain hidden from the public? How could the decision to use the bomb be made with such limited debate? The answer lies in the context of a world war that had already killed tens of millions. The atomic bomb was seen not as a moral aberration, but as a tool to end a terrible conflict. The scientists, driven by fear of a Nazi bomb, rationalized their work as necessary. Once the German threat was gone, many argued for a demonstration or for not using the bomb at all, but the military and political momentum was overwhelming. The project had cost billions. The war was not over. The bomb was ready. The systems that governed the Manhattan Project were designed for one thing: speed. Secrecy was absolute. Plant managers reported to Groves, not to local military or civilian authorities. Security clearances were rigid. Communication between sites was minimal. The scientists were often unaware of the larger picture. Even the families of the workers were told nothing. The town of Los Alamos was built in secret. Mail was censored. Children were told their fathers were doing engineering work. The system failed in some ways. There were spies. Klaus Fuchs, a British physicist working at Los Alamos, passed detailed information about the bomb to the Soviet Union. The U.S. counterintelligence efforts were extensive but not perfect. But the broader failure was not in secrecy. It was in the lack of a mechanism for reconsidering the project's ultimate purpose. After Germany surrendered, the original rationale for the bomb no longer existed. Yet no one stopped the clock. The inertia of the undertaking, combined with the desire to end the war quickly, drove the decision forward. The human consequences are still being measured. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed hundreds of thousands instantly and over the following years. The survivors, known as hibakusha, suffered cancers, birth defects, and lasting trauma. The war ended days later, with Japan surrendering on August 15th, but the new weapon created a world permanently changed. The Manhattan Project left behind a legacy of questions. What does it mean to have the power to destroy an entire city in an instant? How should such weapons be controlled? The Cold War arms race, the nuclear standoff, the proliferation risks, all trace their roots to those fateful days in August 1945. The scientific and engineering achievements were monumental. The moral weight is incalculable. In the final analysis, the Manhattan Project was a product of its time. A desperate war, a race against a feared enemy, a faith in technology, and a willingness to use any means to defend a way of life. It remains a case study in how quickly a secret project can reshape the world, and how the systems built to protect a secret can also blind those inside it to the full implications of their actions. The events of August 6, 1945, did not begin at 2:45 a.m. on Tinian. They began with a letter, a discovery, a fear, and a series of decisions that turned theory into reality. The aircraft, the bomb, the crew, they were the final link in a chain that stretched back years. And that chain was forged in a secrecy so deep that even the men who dropped the bomb did not know exactly what they were carrying until they were in the air. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, on the Pacific island of Tinian, A B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay began its takeoff roll down runway Able. The aircraft carried a crew of 12 men under the command of Colonel Paul Tibbets. In the bomb bay sat a weapon most of them had never seen and would not fully understand until after the war. The official mission order was classified. The bomb itself was codenamed Little Boy, a uranium gun-type device that had never been tested. The Trinity test had used a different design, a plutonium implosion weapon. Little Boy was simpler in principle, but its reliability was theoretical. As the Enola Gay lifted into the dark Pacific sky, the crew knew only that they were carrying a new kind of bomb. They did not know its exact yield, its effects, or the full purpose of their target. At 6:07 a.m., the Enola Gay rendezvoused over Iwo Jima with two support aircraft, one carrying scientific instruments, the other photographic equipment. The formation continued toward Japan. Weather reconnaissance planes had already reported on the primary target, the city of Hiroshima, a major military and industrial center on the southern coast of Honshu. The weather was clear. At 7:25 a.m., the crew armed the bomb. Colonel Tibbets announced over the intercom that they were carrying the first atomic weapon ever used in combat. The crew later described a stunned silence. Some had guessed, others had not. None had fully grasped the scale of what they were about to do. At 8:09 a.m., the Enola Gay reached the initial point about 40 miles southeast of Hiroshima. The bomb bay doors opened. The city below was visible, spread across the delta of the Oda River. The target was the AA Bridge, a T-shaped structure near the city center. At 8:15 a.m., the bombardier released Little Boy. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. The Enola Gay made a sharp turn to escape the blast. At 8:16 a.m., at an altitude of about 1,900 feet, the bomb detonated above the city. What happened next was measured in microseconds. The temperature at ground zero reached several million degrees. The blast wave traveled faster than the speed of sound. Within seconds, nearly everything within a mile radius was flattened or incinerated. Fires erupted across the city. The mushroom cloud rose to over 50,000 feet. The Enola Gay, already more than 11 miles away, was rocked by the shockwave. The crew saw a boiling column of smoke and dust. They reported that the city had disappeared. The destruction was almost total. Of Hiroshima's 76,000 buildings, about 69,000 were destroyed or severely damaged. The population before the bombing was estimated at about 350,000, including military personnel. Between 70,000 and 100,000 people died immediately. Others died from burns, radiation poisoning, and injuries in the hours and days that followed. The city's communications were obliterated. The Japanese military initially assumed a large conventional bombing had occurred. It took hours for Tokyo to learn the truth. How could this have happened? The question is not only about the physics or the engineering. It is about the decision-making chain that led to that moment. The targeting committee had met in May 1945. They selected 4 potential cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. Kyoto was removed from the list at the insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited the city and considered it culturally significant. Hiroshima was chosen because it contained major military headquarters, a port, and industrial facilities. It had not been heavily bombed previously, which meant the effects of the atomic bomb could be clearly assessed. The military planners also considered the psychological impact. A sudden, devastating blow might shock the Japanese leadership into surrender. The alternative was Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, expected to begin in November 1945. Allied planners projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps over 1 million on both sides. The atomic bomb was seen as a way to avoid that bloodbath. Not everyone agreed. A group of scientists at the Met Lab in Chicago, led by James Frank, had written a report in June 1945 urging a demonstration of the bomb on an uninhabited area. The Frank report argued that using the bomb without warning would damage America's moral standing and trigger an arms race. The report reached Secretary of War Stimson, but never fully determined the decision. The Interim Committee, formed to advise on atomic policy, recommended using the bomb as soon as possible against a military target. President Truman authorized its use after the Potsdam Conference, where he received word of the successful Trinity test. The system that produced the decision was designed for speed and secrecy. The scientists and military officers who built the bomb were not in a position to debate its use after Germany surrendered. The project had a momentum of its own. The billions spent, the thousands of workers, the race with Germany, all of it pointed toward a single conclusion: the bomb would be used. The only question was where and when. On August 6, 1945, at 8:16 a.m., that question received its answer. The response from Japan was not immediate. The government in Tokyo debated. The military argued for continuing the war. The emperor remained silent. Meanwhile, the United States prepared a second bomb. The initial schedule called for the next attack on August 11th, but weather forecasts pushed it forward. On the morning of August 9, 1945, at 3:47 a.m. Tinian time, a second B-29 named Boxcar took off with a different weapon. Fat Man, a plutonium implosion bomb similar to the Trinity device. The primary target was the city of Kokura, about 160 miles southwest of Hiroshima. The mission encountered complications. The Boxcar's fuel pump malfunctioned. A critical fuel tank could not be used. The weather over Kokura was poor. Smoke and haze obscured the aiming point. The bombardier could not visually acquire the target, a mandatory requirement for bombing accuracy. After 3 passes over Kokura, the crew made the decision to proceed to the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m. Japanese time, Fat Man detonated over Nagasaki at an altitude of about 1,600 feet. The terrain of Nagasaki, a city built in a series of valleys, limited the blast's reach. Even so, the destruction was catastrophic. About 40,000 people died immediately, with total deaths eventually exceeding 70,000. The industrial and shipping center of the city was destroyed. The secondary target became the site of the second atomic bombing. Still, Japan did not surrender immediately. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, invading Manchuria. The combination of the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry shifted the balance. On the night of August 9th, the Supreme War Council in Tokyo remained deadlocked. Emperor Hirohito intervened, accepting the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. The war was over. The human consequences of these 2 missions are still being documented. Survivors, called hibakusha, suffered from acute radiation syndrome, cancers, and lifelong health problems. Women faced increased rates of miscarriage and birth defects. The cities were rebuilt, but the memory of the bombings remained. The United States conducted further atomic tests in the Pacific, but no nuclear weapon has been used in war since 1945. The Manhattan Project's legacy extends beyond the war. The scientists who built the bomb created an organization that would become the Atomic Energy Commission, later the Department of Energy. The technology spread. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, much earlier than expected. The Cold War arms race accelerated. The hydrogen bomb followed in the 1950s. By the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear warheads to destroy the world many times over. The secrecy that governed the Manhattan Project also had lasting effects. The workers at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos were not told the full nature of their work. Many lived with radiation exposure that would later cause health problems. The government faced decades of lawsuits and compensation claims. The environmental contamination at the production sites required massive cleanup efforts that continue to this day. The moral questions remain unresolved. Was the atomic bomb necessary to end the war? Some historians argue that the Japanese were already defeated, and that a blockade or continued conventional bombing would have forced surrender. Others contend that the atomic bombs saved lives by eliminating the need for an invasion. The debate continues, shaped by the available evidence, which includes intercepted Japanese diplomatic cables, military planning documents, and memoirs of key decision-makers. What is clear is that the Manhattan Project fundamentally changed the relationship between science, government, and warfare. It established a model of large-scale, secret, government-funded research that would be replicated in areas from space exploration to biotechnology. It also created a moral burden that scientists and policymakers have never fully resolved. The events of August 6th and August 9th, 1945, did not occur in a vacuum. They were the result of a chain of decisions made under the pressures of a global war, a fear of a Nazi bomb, and a belief that technological superiority could end the conflict quickly. The secret that ended the war also started a new one, a Cold War fought with the threat of nuclear annihilation. At 2:45 a.m. on Tinian, the Enola Gay began its mission. The crew did not know exactly what they carried until they were in the air. By the time they landed, the world had changed. The Manhattan Project had delivered its final product. The legacy of that morning continues to shape international relations, military strategy, and the collective conscience of humanity. On August 29, 1949, at 7 a.m. local time, a seismic station in Alaska recorded an unusual event. The instruments showed a sudden ground motion originating from somewhere in Asia. The signal did not match an earthquake. It was different, sharper, more compact. The U.S. Air Force had stationed specially equipped aircraft to patrol the Pacific and collect airborne particles. Within days, filters from these flights arrived at a laboratory in Washington. Scientists analyzed the samples for radioactive isotopes. They found fission products consistent with a nuclear explosion. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. What happened? The United States had expected a Soviet atomic weapon to arrive around 1952 or 1953. The Manhattan Project had operated under the assumption that the Soviet program, led by Igor Kurchatov and Lavrentiy Beria, would take years to catch up. That assumption was wrong. Soviet scientists had built a plutonium implosion bomb nearly identical to the Fat Man design. The Trinity test had been witnessed by a small group of Americans. The Soviet test, designated First Lightning, was witnessed by a small group of Russians. The yield was 22 kilotons. The imbalance of power that had defined the immediate post-war years was gone. The detection system that caught the Soviet test was not accidental. The United States had established a monitoring network starting in 1947, led by the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project and the Atomic Energy Commission. Weather flights, seismic stations, and oceanographic surveys were all used to gather evidence of foreign nuclear activity. The system worked, but what it revealed was terrifying to officials in Washington. The atomic monopoly had lasted exactly 4 years. President Harry Truman received the confirmation on September 23, 1949. He made a public announcement that same day. The news shocked the American public. The Cold War, already tense with the Berlin blockade and the formation of NATO, now took on a new dimension. The nuclear arms race had begun in earnest. The Manhattan Project's legacy was no longer a secret weapon that ended a war. It was a technology that had to be controlled in an era of mistrust. But how had the Soviets advanced so quickly? Investigators began to look inward. The Manhattan Project had been kept compartmentalized, but it was not impenetrable. At Los Alamos, a British physicist named Klaus Fuchs had worked on the theoretical calculations for the implosion design. Fuchs was a committed communist. He had been passing detailed reports to Soviet intelligence since 1943, while the war was still ongoing. His information included the design of the plutonium bomb, the method of implosion, and the composition of the tamper and core. After the war, Fuchs returned to Britain and continued his work at the Atomic Energy Research Establishment at Harwell. In late 1949, British intelligence, aided by American signal intercepts, began to close in. Futch was arrested in January 1950. He confessed and provided a full account of his espionage. The Futch case opened a wider investigation. It led to the arrest of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were accused of running a spy ring for the Soviets. The Rosenbergs were tried, convicted, and executed in 1953. The revelations of espionage created a climate of fear within the scientific community. The Manhattan Project's culture of secrecy had already created suspicion. The spy cases amplified it. The question became not just who had leaked, but whether the entire apparatus of classified research could be trusted. The response from the U.S. government was swift. The Atomic Energy Commission requested a massive expansion of the nuclear weapons program. In January 1950, Truman announced his decision to proceed with the development of the thermonuclear bomb, or hydrogen bomb. The Manhattan Project had produced fission bombs. The hydrogen bomb would use the energy of a fission explosion to trigger a fusion reaction, releasing energy on a scale thousands of times larger. The scientific debate over feasibility and morality was intense. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had led the Manhattan Project, argued against the hydrogen bomb on both technical and ethical grounds. Edward Teller, a key physicist at Los Alamos, pushed for its development. The split between these two men became emblematic of the larger conflict between scientific conscience and national security. At 7 a.m. on November 1, 1952, the first thermonuclear device was detonated on the island of Alujilab in the Pacific Proving Grounds. The test, codenamed Ivy Mike, produced a yield of 10.4 megatons, more than 700 times the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. The device was not a deliverable weapon. It was a building-sized structure that relied on liquid deuterium, kept at cryogenic temperatures. But it worked. The Soviet Union quickly followed with its own thermonuclear test in August 1953, using a design that was more compact by using lithium deuteride. The arms race accelerated further. The scale of the testing program raised new questions. The United States conducted hundreds of atmospheric nuclear tests in the Pacific and in Nevada. The fallout spread across the globe. Strontium-90, cesium-137, and other radioactive isotopes entered the food chain. In the mid-1950s, scientists began to measure elevated levels of strontium-90 in children's teeth. The public became aware of the health risks. The debate over nuclear testing became a major political issue. The Atomic Energy Commission, the agency born from the Manhattan Project, was responsible for both promoting nuclear power and regulating its safety. This dual role created conflicts of interest. The commission downplayed the risks of fallout and initiated secret medical experiments on human subjects to study radiation effects. In one known case, mentally disabled children at a school in Massachusetts were fed radioactive oatmeal to study nutrient absorption. In another, patients with terminal cancer were injected with plutonium without their consent. These experiments were not revealed until the 1990s. The Manhattan Project's legacy of secrecy had created a culture where information was tightly controlled and oversight was weak. The scientists who worked on the original project had operated under wartime urgency, but that urgency did not end with the war. The Cold War maintained the pressure. The government funded enormous research complexes: Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia, Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Savannah River. These sites produced tens of thousands of nuclear warheads over the next 4 decades. The production processes released vast quantities of radioactive waste into the environment. At Hanford, Washington, the plutonium production facility created the material for the Fat Man bomb and for thousands of later weapons. The reactor operations and chemical separations released iodine-130 and other isotopes into the Columbia River. Workers were exposed to high levels of radiation. In the 1980s, it was revealed that the government had intentionally released large amounts of radioactive iodine in a secret test known as the Green Run. The long-term health effects on nearby communities and workers are still being studied. The Manhattan Project also changed the relationship between science and the military. Before the project, academic scientists operated largely independently. After the project, the federal government became the primary funder of basic research in physics and chemistry. The National Science Foundation was established in 1950, the National Institutes of Health expanded, and the Department of Defense poured money into university laboratories. The project had shown that centralized, large-scale, goal-oriented research could produce results quickly. That model was applied to other challenges, from the development of the intercontinental ballistic missile to the Apollo program. But the model also carried risks. The Manhattan Project had operated with such secrecy that even senior officials in the government did not know about it until after the bombings. President Truman only learned of the project in full after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April 1945. The congressional oversight was minimal. The project had been funded through a special account that bypassed normal appropriations. When the Atomic Energy Commission took over, Congress created the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy to provide oversight. But the committee often acted as a cheerleader for the nuclear program rather than a watchdog. By the early 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction emerged. The scientists who built the bomb had warned about this possibility. In a 1945 report, the Frank Committee had predicted that a nuclear arms race would follow the use of the bomb. That prediction came true. The Test Ban Treaty of 1963 stopped atmospheric testing, but underground testing continued. The number of warheads peaked in the 1980s at more than 60,000 globally. How did the world end up here? The Manhattan Project was a product of its time, a world war against an adversary believed to be close to developing the same weapon. The fear was real, but the project's success created a new set of problems that have not been solved. The same technology that ended the war also created the possibility of ending civilization. The individual stories that make up this history are many. At Los Alamos, the scientists and their families lived in a fenced community, cut off from the outside. They used code names. Their mail was censored. The children went to school in buildings that looked like military barracks. The isolation was meant to protect the secret, but it also created a community that developed its own culture. Many of the scientists were young, brilliant, and idealistic. They believed they were working on a weapon that would end all war. Some of them later regretted that belief. The men who flew the bombing missions also carried the weight. Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, never expressed remorse. He maintained that the bombing was necessary and that he slept well at night. But other crew members reported nightmares and guilt. The bombardier on the Nagasaki mission, Kermit Behan, later said he thought about it every day. The human cost of the bombings cannot be separated from the human cost of the war itself. More than 60 million people died in World War II. The atomic bombs killed about 200,000 by the end of 1945. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more than 100,000 in a single night. The war was brutal on all sides. The Manhattan Project's legacy also includes the energy produced by nuclear fission. The technology that made bombs also made power plants. The first nuclear reactor to generate electricity was the experimental breeder reactor I in Idaho, which lit 4 light bulbs on December 20, 1951. Commercial nuclear power grew in the 1960s and 1970s, but accidents at 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima raised questions about safety. The waste from nuclear power plants remains hazardous for tens of thousands of years. The solution to that problem has not been found. In the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, the United States and Russia began to dismantle thousands of warheads. The fissile material from those warheads, highly enriched uranium and plutonium, was repurposed or stored. But the threat of nuclear proliferation continued. North Korea developed nuclear weapons. Iran pursued nuclear capabilities. The risk of a nuclear terrorist attack became a new concern. The Manhattan Project had made the world more complex. On July 16, 1945, at 5:29 a.m., the Trinity test changed everything. The scientists who watched the fireball knew they had entered a new era. J. Robert Oppenheimer later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The line is often quoted, but in its full context it is a God speaking about his duty. Oppenheimer used it to express the weight of what he had helped create. He spent the rest of his life trying to control the forces he had unleashed. The Manhattan Project ended with the war, but its effects have not ended. The test sites remain radioactive. The downwinders in Nevada, Utah, and the Marshall Islands continue to suffer health effects. The workers at Hanford and Oak Ridge who were exposed to radiation have filed claims for compensation. The cleanup of the Hanford site alone is estimated to cost more than $100 billion and will take decades. The environmental contamination is a permanent reminder of the cost of the secret that ended the war. What is the final lesson of the Manhattan Project? It is that secrecy and speed can produce extraordinary results, but they can also produce unintended consequences that last for generations. The scientists who built the bomb worked with the best intentions. The military officers who used it believed it would save lives. The decision-makers weighed the options and chose the path they thought was right. But the world they created is a world that has to live with the knowledge that total annihilation is possible, that the technology exists, and that it can be used again. The story of the Manhattan Project is not just about the bomb. It is about people making choices under pressure, about the drive to understand the universe, and about the responsibility that comes with knowledge. The secret that ended the war also started a conversation that has no end. On August 29, 1949, a seismic shockwave traveled through the atmosphere from a remote region of Kazakhstan. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb, code-named First Lightning. The United States lost its monopoly on nuclear weapons far earlier than intelligence agencies had predicted. The event triggered an immediate response inside the American scientific and military establishment. A debate began that would split the Manhattan Project scientists into factions and lead to the development of a weapon that dwarfed the bombs of 1945. What happened next was not automatic. In October 1949, the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, chaired by J. Robert Oppenheimer, met to discuss whether the United States should pursue the hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon that used fusion rather than fission to release energy. The committee's report, delivered on October 30th, recommended against a crash program. Oppenheimer and a majority of the committee argued that the hydrogen bomb was a weapon of genocide, that it had no military necessity, and that the decision would accelerate the arms race. They urged the United States to seek an agreement with the Soviet Union to ban such weapons, but the political climate was different. Truman, facing pressure from Congress, from Cold War hawks, and from scientists like Edward Teller who believed the hydrogen bomb was inevitable, made a different choice. On January 31, 1950, President Truman publicly announced that the United States would develop the hydrogen bomb. The decision was announced as a response to the Soviet atomic test, but it had been in motion for years. Teller had been working on thermonuclear designs since the Manhattan Project. The technical challenge was immense. A hydrogen bomb required a fission trigger powerful enough to ignite fusion fuel. The calculation was more complex than anything the physicists had attempted. At Los Alamos, Teller pushed for a design called the Super, but it kept failing in early computer simulations. A breakthrough came in January 1951, when the mathematician Stanislaw Ulam proposed a design that used radiation pressure to compress the fusion fuel. Teller refined the concept, and by March 1951 the principle was clear. The first test of a thermonuclear device occurred on November 1, 1952, at Inwatak Atoll in the Pacific. The device, code-named Mike, used liquid deuterium as fuel. It was not a deliverable bomb. It weighed more than 70 tons and required a refrigerated building. But when it detonated, the yield was 10.4 megatons, more than 600 times the yield of the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. The fireball was over 3 miles wide. The blast completely vaporized the island on which it was placed, leaving a crater in the ocean floor. The mushroom cloud rose to an altitude of 37 miles. The scientists watching from a control ship described it as the sun rising in the north. By the time the radiation cloud had circled the globe, the arms race had entered a new phase. The test that changed the world's understanding of nuclear weapons came on March 1, 1954. The Castle Bravo test at Bikini Atoll was supposed to be a 6-megaton device. The yield turned out to be 15 megatons, more than double the predicted amount. The explosion created a fireball over 4 miles wide. The radioactive fallout spread over an area much larger than expected. A Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon No. 5, was about 90 miles east of the test site. The crew had no idea a test was taking place. Fine white ash fell on the boat. Within days, the crew began to experience nausea, burns, and hair loss. By the time they returned to Japan, they were suffering from acute radiation syndrome. One crew member died 6 months later. The incident caused a global outcry and became a key moment in the anti-nuclear movement. How did the scientists who built the bomb react to this new scale of destruction? Oppenheimer, who had opposed the hydrogen bomb, found himself increasingly marginalized. His security clearance became a target. In April 1954, the Atomic Energy Commission held a hearing to determine whether Oppenheimer posed a security risk. The hearing lasted 3 weeks. Testimony was given by past colleagues, including Teller. At one point, Teller said he would feel more secure publicly if the country's vital interests did not lie in Oppenheimer's hands. The hearing was not about espionage. It was about Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb and his left-wing associations in the 193's rows. Board voted 2-1 to revoke his clearance. The decision stripped Oppenheimer of his access to classified information. He was forced to leave Los Alamos. He spent the remaining years of his career in relative obscurity, working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. The man who had led the Manhattan Project could no longer work on the weapons he had helped create. The hydrogen bomb decision and the Oppenheimer hearing changed the relationship between scientists and the government. Many scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project became vocal critics of the arms race. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists was founded in 1945, and its doomsday clock began to move closer to midnight. The scientists who had once been celebrated as heroes were now seen by some as dangerous. The debate over nuclear weapons moved from the laboratory to the public sphere. By the early 1960s, the United States had deployed hydrogen bombs in its strategic arsenal. The B-52 bombers kept a constant airborne alert. The Soviets had their own thermonuclear weapons. On October 30, 1961, the Soviet Union detonated the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear weapon ever tested. The yield was 50 megatons, but it could have been designed for 100 megatons. The blast wave circled the Earth 3 times. The fireball was visible over 600 miles away. The test ruined the case for unlimited yields. No larger weapon was ever built. The stage was set for the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was shown photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. The images showed medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. The Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. The intelligence community estimated that there were at least 40 launchers. The warheads were not yet in place, but they were expected within days. What followed was a 13-day crisis that unfolded in real time. Kennedy decided on a naval quarantine of Cuba, not a full invasion. On October 22nd, he addressed the nation. The world watched. The quarantine went into effect on October 24th. 25 Soviet ships were heading toward Cuba. At 10:32 a.m. on October 24th, most of the ships stopped or turned back, but the crisis was not over. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a letter offering to remove the missiles if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. On October 27th, a second letter arrived demanding the removal of American missiles from Turkey. That same day, a U-2 was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. The military wanted to respond with airstrikes. Kennedy held back. At 1:30 p.m. on October 27th, a Soviet submarine B-59 was detected near the quarantine line. The submarine was armed with a nuclear torpedo. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, was exhausted and out of communication. A disagreement broke out among the officers about whether to surface or to fire the torpedo. The decision to fire required the consent of 3 officers. 2 were in favor. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued that the ship should surface. The torpedo was not launched. The submarine surfaced later that day. The crisis ended the next day, October 28th, when Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. The secret trade was the removal of American missiles from Turkey. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that human judgment mattered more than technology. The nuclear command and control systems were not perfect. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication, or a single officer's decision could have triggered a catastrophe. The crisis led to the creation of the hotline between Washington and Moscow, and to the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned atmospheric testing. But underground testing continued. The United States conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests between 1945 and 1990. The Soviet Union conducted over 700. The total explosive yield of all nuclear tests was equivalent to more than 500 megatons. The radiation released from those tests, particularly atmospheric tests, has been linked to increased rates of cancer in populations downwind of test sites. The legacy of the Manhattan Project includes these invisible environmental effects. The arms race did not stop with the test ban. By the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union had deployed multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, on their missiles. Each missile could carry several warheads, each aimed at a different target. The number of warheads multiplied. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, began in 1969, but they only limited the number of launchers, not the number of warheads. The stockpiles continued to grow. The Cold War ended in 1990. The Soviet Union dissolved. The United States and Russia began to reduce their nuclear arsenals under the START treaties. The number of warheads declined from a peak of over 60,000 to about 14,000 by 2010, but the dismantlement was slow. The fissile material from the warheads had to be stored and secured. The risk of nuclear terrorism emerged as a new concern. The material for a crude nuclear device could be stolen from poorly guarded stockpiles. The Manhattan Project had created a problem that could not be undone. In the 1990s and 2010s, nuclear proliferation continued. North Korea tested its first nuclear device in 2006. Iran moved close to developing a nuclear weapon. The International Non-Proliferation Regime, built on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons of 1968, struggled to contain the spread of technology. The Manhattan Project had shown that a determined state could build a bomb in less than 5 years. The knowledge could not be erased. The story of the Manhattan Project does not end with the bombings of 1945. It continues through every test, every treaty, every crisis, every accident. The technology that ended the war also created a permanent state of uncertainty. The scientists who worked on the project understood this. They tried to warn the public and the politicians, but the momentum of the arms race was too strong. The secret that started it all had to be revealed, but its consequences could not be controlled. Yet even as the Cold War settled into a nuclear standoff, the very weapons that had been designed in secrecy began to reveal their dangers in ways no one had anticipated. On March 1, 1954, At 6:45 a.m. local time, a device was detonated on a reef at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. It was part of Operation Castle, a series of tests for the new generation of thermonuclear weapons. The device, codenamed Castle Bravo, was expected to yield about 6 megatons. The scientists had miscalculated. The actual yield was 15 megatons, 2.5 times larger than predicted. The blast created a fireball over 3 miles wide. The mushroom cloud rose to an altitude of 130,000 feet. The thermal radiation ignited fires on islands 20 miles away. The shockwave was felt on atolls over 100 miles distant. But the most dangerous consequence was invisible. The detonation scooped up massive amounts of coral and debris from the reef and injected it into the stratosphere. The debris was laced with fission products, including radioactive iodine-131 and cesium-137. A fine white ash began to fall on the surrounding islands and on the ocean. At 7 a.m., the crew of the Japanese fishing vessel Daigo Fukuryu Maru, or Lucky Dragon 5, observed the flash and heard the blast. They were about 90 miles east of Bikini, outside the declared danger zone. But the wind had shifted. Within hours, a white powdery ash began to fall on the boat. The crew thought it was coral dust. They continued fishing. By evening, some crew members reported nausea and headaches. Their skin began to burn. They did not know that the ash was highly radioactive fallout. On March 2nd, the Lucky Dragon headed back to Japan. Meanwhile, the United States military began to monitor the fallout cloud. The cloud was moving east across the Pacific. Radiation readings on nearby atolls like Rongelap and Utirik were dangerously high. The residents had not been evacuated. On March 3rd, the Navy arrived to take readings. They found that the island of Rongelap had received a dose of radiation equivalent to about 30 times the annual background dose. The people were not told to leave for another 2 days. By then, many had already absorbed significant amounts of radiation. What happened next was a slow unraveling. The crew of the Lucky Dragon arrived at the port of Yezu in Japan on March 14th. They were immediately taken to a hospital. One crew member, Eikichi Kubiyama, died on September 23, 1954. The doctors attributed his death to radiation sickness. The rest of the crew suffered from long-term health problems including cancer and liver damage. The Japanese government protested. The United States did not publicly admit the extent of the contamination for months. How could this have happened? The miscalculation of the yield was traced to a critical misunderstanding of lithium-6 and lithium-7 isotopes. In the design of the hydrogen bomb, a lithium deuteride fuel was used. The scientists assumed that only the lithium-6 isotope would contribute to the fusion reaction. But lithium-7, which made up about 60% of the natural lithium, also reacted when bombarded with high-energy neutrons. That reaction multiplied the yield. The error was not caught because the team had not fully considered the behavior of lithium-7 under extreme conditions. The test had been approved on the basis of flawed calculations. The fallout cloud did not stay in the Pacific. It spread globally. Trace amounts of radioactive material were detected in rainfall in Japan, Europe, and the United States in the weeks following the test. The Castle Bravo event became the first major public health disaster directly linked to nuclear testing. It triggered a wave of international protest. Scientific studies later showed that the radiation from Castle Bravo and other atmospheric tests increased cancer rates in downwind populations, especially in the Marshall Islands and in areas downwind of the Nevada test site. The United States government conducted follow-up studies on the Marshall Islanders, but the response was slow and inadequate. The residents of Rongelap were moved to a different island, but the medical monitoring was inconsistent. By the 1960s, many islanders had developed thyroid cancer, leukemia, and birth defects. The United States eventually paid compensation through the Nuclear Claims Tribunal, but the process was drawn out, and many claims were never fully resolved. The Castle Bravo incident also changed the nature of nuclear diplomacy. The realization that hydrogen bombs could produce unpredictable and far-reaching fallout led to a renewed push for a test ban. In 1958, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union began a moratorium on atmospheric testing. But the moratorium was temporary. In 1961, the Soviets resumed testing with the Tsar Bomba. The arms race continued. Yet the secret of the Manhattan Project had now become a global problem. The test that had been designed to demonstrate American strength instead revealed a vulnerability. No one could control where the fallout went. The atomic bomb had been a weapon of pure destruction. The hydrogen bomb was a weapon of environmental contamination. The difference was not just scale, but character. The Castle Bravo test proved that a nuclear war could poison the entire planet. In the years after 1954, scientists began to focus on the concept of nuclear winter. In 1983, a group led by Carl Sagan and Richard Turco published a paper showing that even a limited nuclear exchange could throw enough soot and dust into the atmosphere to block sunlight, causing global temperature drops and crop failure. The Manhattan Project had not only ended a war, it had opened a door to a form of extinction. The story of the Manhattan Project, then, is not just about the creation of a weapon. It is about the unintended consequences of a secret program. The men who built the bomb were brilliant, but they could not predict how the technology would evolve. They could not foresee the Castle Bravo miscalculation, the contamination of the Marshall Islands, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the nuclear winter scenario. They could not control how other nations would use the knowledge. The secret had to be kept, but once revealed, it could not be taken back. Today, the Manhattan Project is remembered as a turning point in history. The sites where the work was done, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford, remain radioactive and sealed. The fissile material produced in the 1940s still exists. Some of it has been repurposed for naval reactors, some has been disposed of, and some remains in warheads. The scientists who worked on the project are gone, but their legacy lives on in every nuclear power plant, every non-proliferation treaty, every debate about disarmament. The question that remains is not whether the bomb was necessary to end World War II. That debate will continue. The question is whether humanity can manage the technology it created. The Manhattan Project was a triumph of physics, engineering, and secrecy. But its true lesson is that knowledge does not come with a manual. The power that was unleashed on August 6, 1945, is still with us, and the world has never been the same. In the decades since, the number of nuclear weapons has fallen from over 60,000 to fewer than 13,000. But the risks have shifted. The threat of a full-scale nuclear war between superpowers has receded, but the possibility of a nuclear exchange between smaller states or a terrorist group using a stolen warhead remains. The insider threat, as seen in the Germanwings crash, is not limited to aviation. The systems that are designed to protect nuclear weapons, the personnel reliability programs, the two-man rule, the command and control nets, are only as strong as the people who operate them. The Manhattan Project ended the war, but it also began a new era. The secret that was kept so well for so long could not be contained. The scientists who built the bomb hoped that its existence would make war unthinkable. They were right in one sense. No nuclear weapons have been used in combat since 1945. But they were wrong in another sense. The weapon has not prevented war. It has merely changed its shape. The world lives under a nuclear shadow, and that shadow began in the New Mexico desert at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945. The final act of the Manhattan Project is still being written. The last nuclear test conducted by the United States was on September 23, 1992. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was opened for signature in 1996, but it has not entered into force because key nations have not ratified it. Underground tests have continued in North Korea. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons is under strain. The risk of a cascade of new nuclear states is real. What would the scientists of the Manhattan Project think of this world? Oppenheimer, in his later years, spoke of a sense of responsibility. He said that the physicists had known sin. He did not mean that the bomb itself was sinful, but that the knowledge of how to build it carried a moral weight that could not be ignored. Teller, by contrast, continued to advocate for ever more powerful weapons. The two men, once colleagues, ended up on opposite sides of a debate that still divides the scientific community. The secret that ended the war also created a permanent burden. The Manhattan Project was a race against time, and the United States won. But winning meant inheriting a technology that could not be uninvented. The story of the bomb is not just a story of physics and engineering. It is a story of human judgment, of fear, of ambition, and of the consequences of keeping secrets too long. The Manhattan Project was a secret that had to be kept, but once it was revealed, it changed everything, and nothing would ever be the same. At 7 a.m. on October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was shown photographs taken by a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. The images were clear: medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction, Soviet nuclear weapons, capable of hitting Washington, D.C. within minutes. The Cold War had been simmering for years, but this was different. This was the first time the United States faced a nuclear threat from just 90 miles off its coast. What happened next unfolded in tense, measured steps. Kennedy convened a group of senior advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For 13 days, they debated options: a full invasion of Cuba, airstrikes on the missile sites, a naval blockade, or diplomatic negotiations. The military chiefs pushed for immediate airstrikes. The Joint Chiefs of Staff believed that the Soviet Union would not retaliate with nuclear weapons. But Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara were not so sure. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. He announced the discovery of the missiles and declared a naval quarantine around Cuba. Any Soviet ship carrying offensive weapons would be stopped. The world watched as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. On October 24th, the ships slowed and then turned back. But the crisis was far from over. The United States had no idea that Soviet forces in Cuba were already equipped with tactical nuclear weapons. Local commanders had the authority to use them without direct permission from Moscow. The Americans were unaware that the Soviets had already deployed 9 nuclear warheads for short-range missiles, as well as nuclear bombs for bombers. If the United States had invaded, those weapons would have been used. The result would have been a nuclear battlefield. On October 27th, a U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. The military pressed for immediate retaliation. Kennedy held back. He understood that one mistake could escalate into full-scale nuclear war. Meanwhile, a secret channel of communication opened between the White House and the Kremlin through a journalist named John Scully. The Soviet ambassador told Scully that the missiles could be removed if the United States promised not to invade Cuba and secretly removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy accepted the deal. On October 28th, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced that the missiles would be dismantled. The crisis ended, but the world had come closer to nuclear war than at any point before or since. How could this have happened? The Manhattan Project had given the United States a temporary monopoly on nuclear weapons. That monopoly ended in 1949 when the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The arms race accelerated. By 1962, both superpowers had hydrogen bombs with yields measured in megatons. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction had taken hold. If one side launched, the other would retaliate and both would be destroyed. But in Cuba, that doctrine nearly failed because of miscommunication, local command structures, and the sheer speed of events. Investigators later found that the crisis revealed dangerous gaps in command and control. The president did not know about the tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba until years later. The military had not fully considered the consequences of an invasion. The Soviet Union had not authorized the use of the nuclear warheads, but the local commanders had the ability to make that decision independently. The system was not as robust as either side believed. The human consequences were immense. Families in the United States built fallout shelters. Schools conducted duck-and-cover drills. The fear of nuclear war permeated daily life. In Cuba, the population faced the prospect of being caught between two nuclear powers. In the Soviet Union, the leadership realized that their own security was fragile. The aftermath brought important changes. The United States and the Soviet Union established a direct telephone line, known as the hotline, to ensure rapid communication in future crises. In 1963, the Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed, banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. These agreements were direct results of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis also led to a deeper understanding of the psychology of nuclear brinkmanship. But the secret of the Manhattan Project had now been inherited by both superpowers. The United States had built the bomb to end a war, but the bomb had also created a new kind of conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed that the technology could not be controlled by a single nation. It required constant vigilance, careful diplomacy, and a willingness to step back from the edge. The Manhattan Project was not just a scientific achievement. It was the beginning of a permanent state of readiness. The bomb ended World War II, but it also began the Cold War. The crisis of 1962 demonstrated that the weapon's power could be used not just to destroy cities, but to hold entire populations hostage. The scientists who built the bomb had not foreseen this. They had imagined that the weapon would make war unthinkable. They were right, but only barely. Today, the Cuban Missile Crisis is studied as a classic case of crisis management, but it also serves as a warning. The nuclear arsenal that began with the Manhattan Project has not been dismantled. The risks remain. The decisions made in the tense days of October 1962 were influenced by a few individuals, a few conversations, and a few lucky breaks. The next crisis might not have those advantages. The Manhattan Project ended one war, but it opened a door to a world where a single mistake could end everything. The secret that was kept so well for so long had become a burden shared by all of humanity, and nothing would ever be the same.